They say the heart always knows before the mind catches on, and I should have listened to mine. But hindsight doesn't matter when you're standing in the pouring rain, watching your wife walk out of a hotel with a man you've never seen before. It started 3 nights ago when Natalie, my wife of 12 years, came home unusually late. She breezed through the door, kissed me on the cheek like nothing was amiss, and headed upstairs. The scent of her perfume lingered longer than it should have. It was a different one than I'd bought her last Christmas, a subtle, spicy undertone I didn't recognize. But that wasn't what stuck out. It was the smirk. Not a playful smile or a genuine expression of happiness, but a smirk, a smug, self-satisfied curve of her lips. Like she knew a secret I didn't. The next day, I convinced myself it was nothing. Stress from work, maybe. Or a reaction to some joke she'd heard on the way home. But that night, she left again. No explanation, just a vague excuse about needing time to think. When Natalie started coming home late a third time, I decided to follow her. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do. But as I trailed her car through the darkened streets of our quiet town, my mind was alive with a million scenarios. Was she meeting a friend? A therapist? Was she in some kind of trouble? I wanted to believe anything other than what the gnawing pit in my stomach kept whispering. She parked outside a boutique hotel, one of those trendy, overpriced places with fairy lights strung across the entrance. I stopped my car a few blocks down and walked back, keeping my distance. The rain had started to come down in earnest, soaking me to the skin, but I barely noticed. Standing there in the shadows, I watched the hotel's glass doors swing open. Natalie stepped out. Her hair was damp, her coat loosely draped over her shoulders. She was laughing. And then he followed, a tall guy with broad shoulders and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the world will bend over backward for you. The way she touched his arm, the way he leaned in like he couldn't get enough of her. I didn't need to see anything else. I turned and walked away before they could notice me, the sound of their laughter echoing in my ears. When I got home that night, the house felt different. Not physically, it was still the same 2-story colonial with the creaky floorboard near the kitchen and the faint smell of Max's fur hanging in the air, but different in my mind. Every corner now seemed filled with questions I didn't want answers to. The framed pictures on the mantel felt mocking, the bed upstairs uninviting. I sat on the couch, soaked and staring blankly at the dark television screen, my wet clothes leaving a spreading stain on the cushions. Max padded over and sat at my feet, sensing something was wrong. I stayed there for hours, listening to the sounds of the night, distant cars, a neighbor's barking dog, the refrigerator humming. I wasn't thinking clearly, but my mind kept circling back to the same thing. I had to know. This wasn't some minor misunderstanding or overreaction, something was going on, and it was serious enough for her to sneak around. I wasn't going to sit back and let my imagination do all the damage. When Natalie came home, I pretended to be asleep. It wasn't hard, she didn't bother to check on me. Her footsteps creaked up the stairs, the bedroom door clicked shut, and then silence. If guilt weighed on her, she was good at hiding it. The next morning, I started to act. I didn't accuse her or even let on that I suspected anything. Confronting her without proof would only lead to denials, and I wasn't ready to hear her lies. Instead, I leaned into routine. I kissed her goodbye as she left for work and told her I might be home late, playing up a non-existent meeting at the office. Natalie nodded, her expression unreadable, but something about the way she avoided my eyes set my pulse racing. At 3:30 that afternoon, I drove to the boutique hotel. I didn't know what I expected to find, but the place was buzzing. A few business types milled around the lobby, laptops and phone chargers in hand, while a wedding party crowded the bar. I wasn't interested in any of them. I went straight to the front desk and waited my turn. When the clerk greeted me, I said, "I think my wife might have dropped something here yesterday." "Room key, maybe? Can you check?" The young woman hesitated, her smile faltering. "Do you know which room she was in?" "I think it was under the name Natalie Carter," I replied. "I don't know the room number." "She checked out this morning." The lie rolled off my tongue so easily it surprised me. The clerk looked at me for a moment, as if trying to decide whether I was being honest or pulling some kind of scam. I didn't flinch. Finally, she said, "1 second, sir," and disappeared into the office behind the desk. She returned with a slip of paper. "Room 408, she said. "It was checked out this morning." I nodded and thanked her, the heat rising in my face. Room 408. Just saying it in my head made the situation feel more real. She'd spent the night there. With him. The next step wasn't one I took lightly. It felt invasive, wrong even, but this was my marriage on the line, my life as I knew it. I called a private investigator. It wasn't hard to find one. After a few Google searches and a tense phone call, I was meeting a wiry man in his late 50s named David Palmer in the back corner of a diner. He had the look of someone who'd seen too much of life's underbelly, a thinning mustache, sharp eyes that didn't miss a thing, and a way of talking that put me on edge. He was polite, efficient, and didn't sugarcoat anything. "You're sure about this?" he asked as he slid a contract across the table. "Once I start, you can't take it back." I hesitated for only a second before signing. David leaned back in his seat and said, "Tell me everything you know. Times, places, habits. The more details, the better." I laid it all out, her new perfume, the late nights, the hotel, the smirk. Every small piece of the puzzle I had. He scribbled notes in a battered notebook and nodded occasionally. "All right," he said when I finished. "I'll follow her discreetly. It won't take long, these things never do. When I have something concrete, you'll be the first to know." He was right. It didn't take long. 2 days later, David called me. "You're going to want to see this in person," he said. We met at his office, a cramped space above a dry cleaner's, the walls lined with filing cabinets and framed newspaper articles about his past cases. He slid a manila envelope across the desk. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside were photographs, crisp, clear, and damning. Natalie walking arm in arm with the man from the hotel, laughing at something he said. The two of them sharing a drink at a secluded bar. A kiss exchanged in a parked car. And the last photo, them entering a house together. His house. I stared at the images, my stomach churning. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just some misunderstanding or harmless flirtation. It was real, and it was ongoing. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice hoarse. David handed me another sheet of paper. "Daniel Peterson," he said. "Recently divorced. Works in finance. No kids." I nodded, my mind racing. I wanted to smash something, scream, confront her, him, both of them. But I didn't. Not yet. "What's the address?" I asked. David raised an eyebrow but gave me the information. That night, I couldn't look at her. Natalie was cheerful, chatting about her day like nothing was wrong. I answered with grunts and nodded when necessary, but inside I was seething. Every word out of her mouth felt like a betrayal. I knew I had to confront her soon. But first, I needed to prepare. The storm was coming, and I would make damn sure I was ready for it. The decision to confront Natalie wasn't one I made lightly. After seeing the photographs and learning the identity of Daniel Peterson, I spent hours pacing the house, my thoughts colliding in a chaotic mess. Max followed me from room to room, his big brown eyes filled with concern, but I barely noticed. This wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage, it was an insult to everything we had built together over 12 years. By the next day, I had a plan. It wasn't elaborate or overly dramatic, I didn't see the point in theatrics. But it was calculated and, most importantly, unavoidable. I wanted the truth, and I wanted it from her. Face to face. That evening, Natalie came home from work at her usual time, 6:45 p.m., her keys jangling in the door before she stepped inside. She was dressed in her office attire, a tailored blazer over a blouse, pencil skirt, and heels. Her hair was slightly disheveled from the commute, and she carried a reusable coffee cup that was only half full. "Hey," she called out, setting her bag on the kitchen counter. "You wouldn't believe the day I had." I was sitting at the dining table, staring at my laptop, pretending to work. Hearing her voice made my chest tighten. I kept my eyes on the screen and muttered a greeting. She walked over and leaned down to kiss me on the cheek, but I moved slightly, letting her lips brush the air instead. She frowned but said nothing, heading to the fridge for a bottle of water. "How was your day?" she asked, twisting the cap off. "Fine," I said. My voice was flat, giving nothing away. She paused and looked at me. "Are you okay? You seem off." I finally glanced up at her, taking in the way she tilted her head, feigning concern. It was almost enough to make me lose my composure, but I held firm. "I need to talk to you," I said. "Now." Natalie's smile faltered. "Okay," she said slowly. "What's this about?" "Sit down." I gestured to the chair across from me. She hesitated but complied, setting her bottle on the table. I pulled out the manila envelope and slid it toward her. "Open it." "What is this?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Just open it." Her fingers trembled slightly as she unsealed the envelope and pulled out the photographs. At first, her expression was blank, as if her brain refused to process what she was seeing. Then her face drained of color, and she dropped the pictures onto the table like they were burning her hands. "Jason, she began, but I cut her off. "Don't," I snapped. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. I know everything, Natalie. I know about Daniel. I know about the hotel. I know about his house. So spare me the bullshit." She stared at me, her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Not what I think?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I can't put two and two together? You've been sneaking around with him for God knows how long, lying to my face every single day. And you have the audacity to tell me it's not what I think?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she shook her head. "I never meant for this to happen," she said, her voice cracking. "I swear, Jason, it wasn't supposed to." "Don't," I interrupted again. "Just don't." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the refrigerator. Natalie buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. I didn't feel sorry for her. If anything, her tears only made me angrier. "How long?" I demanded. She looked up, her face streaked with mascara. "What? How long?" My words were clipped, each one hitting her like a blow. Natalie hesitated, then said, 6 months. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms. 6 months. Half a year of lies, deception, and betrayal. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What did I do wrong?" "You didn't do anything wrong," she said quickly. "It wasn't about you. I felt lost. Unappreciated. Like I was fading into the background." "Fading into the background?" I repeated, incredulous. "I've spent the last 12 years doing everything I can to support you, to make you happy. And this is how you repay me?" "It wasn't about repaying you," she said, her voice rising. "It was about me. About what I needed. And what you needed was another man." I shot back. "You couldn't talk to me, your husband? You had to go behind my back and destroy our marriage?" "I didn't destroy it," she shouted, slamming her hands on the table. "I made a mistake. A horrible, unforgivable mistake. But don't act like this is all on me. Our marriage wasn't perfect, Jason. You know that." Her words hit me like a slap. "So it's my fault now?" I said, my voice shaking with rage. "You're blaming me for your affair?" "I'm not blaming you," she said, her tone softening. "I'm just saying, things weren't as perfect as you thought." I stared at her, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to lash out, to throw something, to scream until my throat was raw. But another part of me, a smaller, quieter part, felt a pang of doubt. Was she right? Had I been blind to the cracks in our marriage? "No," I said finally. "This isn't on me. This is on you. You made the choice to cheat. You made the choice to lie. Don't try to pin this on anyone else. Natalie didn't respond. She just sat there, her shoulders slumped, tears streaming down her face. I pushed my chair back and stood. We're done here, I said. I'll sleep in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what happens next. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. Jason, please. Don't, I said, my voice cold. I can't do this right now. I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the evidence of her betrayal. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the lumpy mattress in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the confrontation over and over. I thought I'd feel better after confronting her, but if anything, I felt worse. The truth was out, but it brought no relief, only a crushing sense of loss. Morning came, and with it, the realization that the hardest part was still ahead. This was only the beginning. The storm wasn't over. It was just getting started. I woke up the next morning with a single, clear thought: Natalie had to feel the weight of what she'd done. Her tears, her apologies, and her excuses meant nothing. She needed to understand, not just intellectually, but deep in her bones, the destruction she'd caused. It wasn't enough to just confront her. I wanted her to experience the kind of pain she'd inflicted on me. Revenge isn't something you plan lightly, and it isn't something you dive into without precision. I wasn't going to scream in the streets or flip a dinner table. No, I needed a plan that would dismantle her carefully curated world. This wasn't about making her suffer for the sake of it, it was about justice, balance. If she wanted to tear down our life together, I was going to hand her the wrecking ball and watch. The first step was to ensure I controlled the narrative. If she thought for a second that she could spin her affair into a misunderstanding or paint herself as a victim, she was mistaken. I called my lawyer, Alan Silverman, a no-nonsense man who had handled my buddy Greg's divorce a few years back. Jason, Alan said when he answered, his voice calm and professional, I heard from Greg you might be reaching out. What's going on? I need to file for divorce, I said flatly. My wife cheated on me. There was a pause on the line, then Alan said, I'm sorry to hear that. Let's get started. Over the next hour, I laid out everything. The photos, the timeline, the financial details. Alan asked questions about joint accounts, property ownership, custody arrangements for the kids, and I answered as best as I could. By the end of the call, I felt like I had a grip on at least one part of the chaos. Jason, Alan said before we hung up, you're entitled to your anger, but don't let it cloud your judgment. Divorce is about strategy, not emotion. I understand, I said. And I did. But that didn't mean I was going to sit back and play nice. The next step was gathering ammunition. I spent the rest of the day combing through our shared life, cataloging everything that could work in my favor. Bank statements, credit card bills, text messages, anything that could paint a clear picture of Natalie's betrayal and prove she'd been funneling resources into her affair. It didn't take long to find what I needed. There were hotel receipts, unexplained charges on her credit card, and even a few photos she'd uploaded to a shared cloud folder by mistake. I printed everything and organized it into neat folders, ready to hand over to Alan. Then came the harder part, digging into Daniel Peterson. People underestimate how much you can learn about someone with a little patience and a lot of internet access. I started with his LinkedIn profile, which gave me the basics: his job, his company, his professional connections. From there, I branched out, searching for anything that could be useful. It didn't take long to find a goldmine. Daniel was the CFO of a mid-sized firm, a position that came with a hefty salary but also a lot of scrutiny. One late-night search led me to a forum where employees anonymously discussed their workplaces. A few posts mentioned Daniel in less than flattering terms: poor financial management, shady expense reports, and rumors of an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate. Bingo! I took screenshots of everything and added them to my growing arsenal. It wasn't definitive proof of wrongdoing, but it was enough to plant seeds of doubt. By the time I was done, it was close to midnight. Natalie had spent the day avoiding me, holed up in the bedroom. I hadn't spoken to her since our confrontation, and I had no intention of breaking the silence until I was ready. The next morning, I made my first move. While Natalie was at work, I sent an anonymous email to Daniel's company. The message was brief and to the point. Subject: confidential information. To whom it may concern. Your CFO, Daniel Peterson, has been involved in an extramarital affair with a subordinate. Attached are documents and photographs that may be of interest. Regards, a concerned party. I attached a selection of the photos and receipts, careful to omit anything that could link the email back to me. Then I hit send. I wasn't naive enough to think this would get him fired outright. Corporate scandals rarely played out that neatly. But it would stir the pot. Daniel's reputation would take a hit, and even if nothing came of it professionally, he'd know someone was watching. The next phase of my plan was more personal. That evening, I called Natalie's parents. They lived a few hours away and were always quick to pick up when I called. Jason, her mom, Carol, said cheerfully. "How are you?" "Not great," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I need to talk to you and Bob about something important. Can I come over tomorrow?" Carol hesitated. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said simply. "I'll explain when I get there." The following day, I drove to their house with a folder of evidence in the passenger seat. Carol and Bob greeted me at the door, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. Once we were seated, I handed them the folder and explained everything. To their credit, they didn't try to defend Natalie. Carol cried, and Bob looked like he wanted to punch a wall, but neither of them tried to make excuses. "We'll talk to her," Bob said finally. "I don't need you to talk to her," I said. "I need you to understand what's happening. This isn't fixable. I'm filing for divorce, and I don't want her spinning some sob story to you." Bob nodded. Understood. The final step was the most cathartic. I waited until the weekend, when Natalie and the kids were out of the house. Then I packed her belongings into boxes, taped them shut, and stacked them neatly in the garage. When she came home, she found a note on the dining table. "Natalie, your things are in the garage. We're done. Jason." She stormed into the living room, her face red with anger. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, waving the note. "This," I said calmly, "is the end of the line. You made your choice, Natalie. Now I'm making mine." She stared at me, her chest heaving, but she didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. As she left the house that night, slamming the door behind her, I felt a strange sense of relief. The revenge wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this was a start. The days following Natalie's departure were surreal. For the first time in over a decade, the house was empty. Emma and Ryan stayed with their grandmother for the week. My mother had insisted on taking them when I told her what was happening. It gave me time to think, to process, to figure out what came next. But I didn't spend much of that time thinking. I spent it preparing. Despite Natalie's betrayal, we had too much history for me to simply cut ties and walk away without a final reckoning. I needed answers, not the weak excuses she'd given during our first confrontation, but the truth. I needed to know how she had justified destroying our family for 6 months of sneaking around. And I needed her to understand that this was the end of the road. On Friday evening, Natalie called me. Her voice was tentative, cautious. "Jason," she said. "We need to talk." "I agree," I replied, my tone as cold as the anger still bubbling beneath the surface. "Come by tomorrow at noon." The next day, I was ready when she arrived. She stepped into the living room, looking worn and uneasy, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. She wasn't dressed for battle, no sharp blazer or polished makeup. Just jeans and a sweatshirt, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity. But then I remembered the photographs, the hotel bills, the months of lies. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the couch. She obeyed, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an escape route. I stayed standing, keeping my distance. "You wanted to talk," I said. "So talk." Natalie took a deep breath, her hands clutching at each other in her lap. Jason, I know I hurt you, she began. I know what I did was wrong, and I'm sorry. Sorry? I repeated, my voice sharp. You're sorry? You think an apology is going to fix this? I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said quickly. I need you to understand why it happened. I crossed my arms. By all means, enlighten me. She hesitated, then said, it wasn't about him. It wasn't even about you. It was about me. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. I thought if I could just feel wanted again. Save it, I snapped. You want to feel wanted? Try talking to your husband. Try working on your marriage instead of sneaking around behind my back. I tried, she protested. I tried to talk to you, Jason, but you were always so busy, so focused on work or the kids or anything but me. And that's your excuse? That's how you justify throwing away 12 years of marriage? Because I was working to support our family? Natalie flinched but didn't back down. I'm not justifying it. I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you. But it wasn't as simple as me waking up one day and deciding to cheat. It was 1,000 little things. Spare me the psychoanalysis, I said. What I want to know is why you kept it going. After the first time, why didn't you stop? Why didn't you come to me and admit what you'd done? She looked down at her hands. I was scared, she whispered. I knew if I told you, you'd leave. And I couldn't handle that. So instead, you doubled down, I said. You kept lying, kept sneaking around, and hoped I'd never find out. And now you want me to believe you're sorry? That you're the victim in all this? I'm not a victim, she said, her voice trembling. I know that. But Jason, I didn't stop loving you. I never stopped loving you. I laughed bitterly. You have a funny way of showing it. Natalie's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel any satisfaction in seeing her cry. If anything, it made me angrier. She didn't get to play the victim now, not after everything she'd done. The conversation shifted then, from her excuses to the practicalities of what came next. I told her I was filing for divorce, that I'd already spoken to a lawyer. I laid out my terms: joint custody of the kids, no spousal support. She could keep her car and whatever personal belongings she wanted, but the house and savings were staying with me. Natalie didn't argue. She nodded silently, her hands twisting in her lap. When I finished, she said, can I say goodbye to the kids before I leave? They're with my mom, I said. I'll bring them back tomorrow. She nodded again, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her choices had finally caught up to her. Thank you, she said softly. I didn't respond. I walked to the door and opened it, waiting for her to leave. She paused in the doorway, her eyes searching mine one last time. I'm sorry, Jason, she said. For everything. And then she was gone. After she left, I sat in the empty living room and let the silence wash over me. The anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it was all still there, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something else. Closure. The marriage was over, but I wasn't. I had my kids, my career, my life. And I was going to make sure that no matter what came next, I wouldn't let this define me. In the weeks after Natalie left, life was quiet in a way I wasn't used to. The kids came home the day after our final conversation, and while I had anticipated awkwardness, their reaction surprised me. They were subdued but not shocked. We knew something was wrong, Dad, Emma said one night as we sat at the dinner table. She poked at her spaghetti, avoiding my eyes. You and Mom were so different lately. Ryan, younger and more straightforward, asked, Are you getting divorced? Yes, I replied honestly. We are. Because of another man, he blurted out, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. My chest tightened. How did you know? Ryan shrugged, his expression as neutral as a 13-year-old could muster. I overheard Grandma talking on the phone when I stayed over. She didn't mean for me to hear, but I did. Emma's eyes widened, and she looked at her brother, then back at me. Is it true? Yes, I said after a moment, deciding that honesty was the only option. Your mom made some choices that hurt our family. But it's not your fault, and it doesn't change the fact that we both love you. The words felt hollow, even as I said them. How could Natalie truly love the kids when her actions had torn their lives apart? But I swallowed my bitterness for their sake. They deserved stability, not my anger. Natalie and I worked out a custody arrangement that was amicable, if not ideal. The kids would spend every other week with her in the small apartment she rented downtown. She made efforts to stay involved in their lives, attending school events, helping with homework during her weeks, but the cracks were visible. Emma, more sensitive and introspective, withdrew when she was with Natalie. Ryan became defiant, acting out in ways he never had before. It was hard to watch, but it wasn't my job to fix their relationship with their mother. My role was to be there for them, to provide a sense of normalcy and support. I threw myself into parenting with a focus I hadn't known I was capable of. Professionally, things began to improve as well. Without the emotional weight of Natalie's betrayal hanging over me, I was able to concentrate on work again. My boss, who had noticed my decline during the worst of it, pulled me aside one day. "Jason," he said, "whatever's been going on, it looks like you've turned a corner. Your last project was excellent." "Thank you," I said. "I'm getting there." He nodded. "Good. Keep it up." Despite the progress I was making, there were still moments when the past crept up on me. I'd see a photo from a family vacation, one of Natalie's favorite mugs in the back of a cabinet, and it would hit me all over again. The betrayal, the loss, the unanswered questions. I didn't want her back, but I couldn't erase the years we'd spent together. They lingered like ghosts, reminding me of what had been and what could never be again. One day, while cleaning out the garage, I came across a box of her things I hadn't realized I'd kept. It was mostly old trinkets, ticket stubs from concerts, a few journals, a scarf I'd given her for Christmas years ago. At the bottom of the box was a framed photo of the four of us, taken at the beach. We were smiling, arms around each other, the kids still young enough to cling to our legs. I stared at the photo for a long time before setting it aside. It didn't belong in the trash, but it didn't belong in my house either. Later that week, I gave the box to Natalie when she came to pick up the kids. She accepted it without a word. In the end, the divorce was finalized with little fanfare. The paperwork arrived in the mail on a gray Tuesday afternoon. I sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, and signed my name on the dotted line. Just like that, 12 years of marriage were reduced to a few sheets of paper and a legal stamp. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. Months passed, and the pieces of my life began to settle into place. The kids adjusted to the new normal, and while their relationship with Natalie was still strained, they seemed happier overall. I made time for myself, working out, reconnecting with old friends, picking up hobbies I'd let fall by the wayside during the marriage. One evening, Greg, my nosy but loyal neighbor, invited me over for a beer. We sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Better than I thought I would," I admitted. "It's been freeing, in a way." Greg nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "You're stronger than most, Jason. A lot of guys would have let this kind of thing break them." "It came close," I said. "But I've got the kids. They keep me grounded." "Good. Keep it that way," he said. "And hey, when you're ready, there's a whole world out there. Don't let her take that from you." By the time the first anniversary of the divorce rolled around, I realized Greg was right. Natalie's betrayal had changed me, but it hadn't defined me. I was more cautious, more protective of my heart, but I wasn't bitter. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind a quiet determination to move forward. One Saturday, I took the kids to the park. Ryan challenged me to a game of soccer, while Emma sat on a bench, sketching in her notebook. As I chased Ryan across the grass, laughing as he tried to fake me out, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough.